Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. We're really excited to be here and part of the ARMA Connects summer series. Should be really fun today. So we're going to be talking about a large-scale migration at a government agency. And this will be a deep dive look into that particular project. We'll be going through some stories and lessons learned. And once again, thanks again for ARMA Canada. I think they're on the line today, so I'll give a shout out to them. And thanks everyone for taking the time to attend today. So just a couple of quick bits of housekeeping. Before we get started, we do have a Q&A panel, so you should see that within your Teams window. You can ask questions, leave comments. We'll be looking at it throughout the webinar and answering as many questions as we can, and we have a bit of time at the end as well to address any questions. And we're sharing a recording and the presentation as well. We'll share that after the event to the email that you registered with. And so just in terms of what we're covering, so let's get into it, what we're actually going to be covering today. I'm just going to advance the slide here, get this going. So you should see coming up here what we're going to be talking about. And we'll do some quick introductions, and then we will do a deep dive into that case study. We'll spend the majority of the time talking about that. And you don't want to leave at the end. We will wrap up with some of our top 5 mistakes that we see sort of across all of our clients and in our experience on ECM and records management projects. So I'll hand it over to Michael, who will be just giving some quick introductions.
Thanks, Jas. Good afternoon, everyone, and or good morning, depending on where you are across our country here. My name is Michael Schweitzer. I'm actually the CEO, President and CEO of Gravity Union. I've been working with Collabware and SharePoint for, over 10 years now, and all kinds of cool experience that you can read on the right-hand side there. And then with me today is Jas Shukla, who you just met.
Yes, and so I have to wear a couple of different hats here at Gravity Union. I work on strategy, thought leadership, as well as a senior consultant. I started my career at Microsoft on the SharePoint product team, and I haven't ever really left. It's been a rewarding journey, learned a lot about user experience and design and building things that people at work can use, whether it's document management, records management, employee portals. I'm really passionate about that in my career as well. I'm on the Collabware user group board member as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Jas. So just to tell you a little bit about who Gravity Union is, we are a Canadian-based, compliance-inspired services firm that really helps organizations with their digital transformations, typically onto SharePoint or Office 365, and then layering on compliance with Collabware or Collab Space, depending on if you're in the cloud or on premises. We kind of work with anyone and everyone, but we do have a fairly heavy focus on government agencies and regulatory bodies across Canada. A bunch of stats, cool stats that you can download the recording and pause this and then check those out at some point in the future. But I want to get into the case study as quickly as possible. So the case study, yeah. So we'll go kind of spawn this. There's been lots of projects in the market that maybe haven't gone super perfectly. Or took a wrong turn, etc. And this is sort of one of our flagship projects over the past year that went super successful. So really hoping to share our story with you about the case study, and there's hoping to be some lessons learned and some takeaways for you to go back to your own organizations. So a bit about the client. The client was a provincial agency. This must not be there. Around 4,000 people in total. Size of the organization, but really we worked with their head office, which had around 800 people spread across 50 departments. And they are sort of a liquor distribution organization that serves up liquor to one of our great provinces. And of course, recently with the changes to the laws, they were taking on the sale of cannabis to the province as well. So they were undergoing quite a bit of significant change. They were lots going on. They were a growing organization, increasing complexity around records management, so on and so forth, and that sort of organization. The project justification, they had rolled out an ECM platform back in 2009 that was no longer supported by its vendor, what we call a burning platform. So it was out of support, and so if the system went down or something got corrupted, they may not be able to bring that up. So there was a lot of risk in kind of not moving off of that old platform. They were moving from one office to many offices. They're moving out of sort of one big location that had their distribution facility and their head office to multiple locations, including a different data center, a distribution facility, and a head office at 3 different locations. The ECM server was not expected to survive the move, so it was kind of being held together with duct tape and bubble gum. And there was a great concern that if they shut it off and moved it to the new data center, that it wouldn't turn back on. And obviously taking on cannabis as an offering was increasing its need around complexity and compliance. So making sure that you know, people who are buying cannabis in the province won't get reported to the states, etc. So that was sort of the justification. And obviously we're a fast-growing organization to meet that need. So very complex scenario. Perhaps a different view into the organization. At the time, they had 56 departments at the start with around 600 users, and that grew to 800 as the cannabis offering grew. They had around 4 million documents in the current system. We had planned to do 2 to 3 integrations with various line of business systems. So, for example, hooking into their HR system so that when we added a new employee to the employee files, we would automatically create a folder in SharePoint and a case file in Collabware. And then we kind of had a hard deadline of 18 months because that was sort of when the office move was going to be. So the objectives for the project was to standardize on SharePoint across the entire organization for all content, really going for that single source of truth, that utopia type of solution. We were going to classify all the content against the file plan, even including non-record, so you know, transitory content or convenience files, stuff like that, to make sure that every document in the organization had a life cycle around it, so we can remove some of the low value stuff like those embarrassing Halloween photos, etc. Over time. And then to move all of that content from the current solution before the office move, given the risk that we had with that server not recuperating. What the project team looked like. So it was a fairly large, you know, give or take, we had 20 people attached to the project. And so you can see the split between our organization and them. So we partnered with them. We had a PM from each side. We had fulfilled some IT support roles there. We had a couple of solution architects from each side, some change managers, the Tiger teams. And the Tiger teams were really the people that were doing the heavy lifting. And so the idea was that we paired up one-to-one with someone from their organization, and each Tiger team was typically juggling 2 to 3 departments at a given time to move them forward. We had 2 developers that focused on large-scale migrations and integrations. We had an internal steering committee that was very supportive in the organization that helped us work through hard decisions and hurdles. And then we had 2 records managers in the organization that we were working with. So, and as we were working through the organization, rolling out SharePoint, we were also applying Collabware to get that dimension of compliance to the solution. From a technology perspective, most of you are probably aware of these products, but SharePoint was sort of the core platform. It was an on-premise solution, but I would argue that most of the process and the stuff that you're seeing today really doesn't change, even in a SharePoint Online environment. And then we had Collabware CLM as the records management product, and then CollabMail as an Outlook add-in. If you've never seen SharePoint before, it's a web-based document management system that has version control and security and metadata and all that great functionality. Collabware is essentially a records management tool that sits on top of SharePoint, more or less seamlessly and more or less behind the scenes. The idea is that you're going into SharePoint every day to just do your job. You're managing your employee files, you're working on your projects, you're updating your file plan, whatever that happens to be. And then behind the scenes, we've trained Collabware to recognize content, classify it against the file plan, and then run a lifecycle workflow against that content to be in user compliance. And then finally, CollabMail is just a plugin for Outlook. So I can drag and drop emails into emails being sent, or drag and drop my emails from the email server essentially right into SharePoint on the right-hand side there. So the project philosophy, and so this is sort of what we came to the project with, is our approach that we've been fine-tuning. I've personally been fine-tuning over the past 10 years. And we know there's a lot of failures in the space of people that roll out large-scale records management systems and projects that don't necessarily go as well. This is an article that came out a couple of years ago. And so some research said that basically after 20 years of projects, you know, about half of those fail, and the half that, you know, succeed, maybe really only half of those are really providing value to the business. And so this is sort of the problem that a lot of projects face even to this day. So, why those projects fail, I think for the most part is that these projects are seen as a technology problem and not as a people problem. But fundamentally, we view this problem space as a people problem, and we sort of have some foundational philosophies as to how we approach that from more of a people-centric approach. So some of the approaches we talk about. So we focus on enablement. And so if you're engaged with a consulting firm, this should sort of be the mindset, is that you have some people internally that work on the project with a consultancy firm to make sure that you're gleaning as much information from them as possible. It really does take a long time to master this space and the technology and the processes around it and the governance that goes along with it. And so think of it as an apprenticeship. And just like becoming a cabinet maker, you can't just learn cabinet making in a weekend and be proficient at it. It's going to take a year or two to really master those skills. And so the best way to do that is to have people from your organization be part of the project, so that by the end of the project, they sort of become SharePoint and Collabware masters, if you will. Very agile approach. So what we want to do is we want to have these iterations, trying to minimize the time from the business, just kind of keep things light and nimble. Focusing on the user experience, what we call user experience squared. So just the notion that the journey should be fun. And the actual experience, that the final solution should be an easy to use system that really drives adoption. And then finally, just being a very lean project. So not overly concerned with creating tons and tons of documentation. Our goal is to really get to that prototype, get it in front of end users, get their feedback, and make sure they're happy with it. So those are some of the philosophies. Some more philosophies. This actually comes from a book called Drive from Daniel Pink. So a lot of science behind how do we actually enact change in behavior for people. And so these are sort of an underpinning for the project as well. So the notion of autonomy, the notion that we want to have people have a say in what we're building for them. At the end of the day, this is a tool or solution that people are going to have to use on a daily basis every day moving forward. And they arguably should have a say in what we're building to make sure that they're happy with it, that it meets their needs, etc. And I think we all know that when we have more control over something that we're building, it becomes more fun, we get more engagement from end users as well. The notion of mastery. So the reality is you really do need people to be just as comfortable with the tool set as they are with network file storage and email. If we never have an adoption problem with network file storage, if anything, we have an over adoption problem. And we sort of want to have that same thing with SharePoint. So really doing a bunch of training, and you'd be shocked at the number of organizations I've talked to where they have no training, or they just do an hour of training. And it's just not enough. And then finally, purpose. So one of my favorite stories around purpose was an organization that we worked with their hiring practice, and they had the hiring practice of posting a job posting in their local paper, getting a bunch of resumes, printing them off, and circulating a binder around the organization from office to office and getting feedback from managers. And invariably, the binder was lost on top of a fridge in a puddle of coffee under a newspaper. And the turnaround time to get feedback from managers on potential applicants was on the order of 2 to 3 months. And of course, anyone talented in the job market is going to be picked up in that 2-month period. And so they're always sacrificing on organizational fit or skill set, etc. And so, build them an online SharePoint portal to manage their job offerings, get digital feedback from managers. And so that turnaround time went from 2 to 3 months done in 2 or 3 days, and it really changed your organization from the inside out, because now you're able to hire people who are a better cultural fit, who have a better, have the right skill sets, etc. And it really created a better place to work. So as much as you can, like really try and figure out how is this solution going to help those end users if they're in the government? How is it going to help them respond to constituents faster, or just create better service internally, whatever that happens to be. So these really kind of underlined a lot of the decisions. And so when we came across, for example, how much training we're going to do, we're going to answer those questions with, well, if our goal is mastery, clearly one hour or half an hour is just not enough training to gain mastery over that. Anyways, I highly recommend a book from Daniel Pink called Drive. So from a high level, the project phases, we kicked things off. We got introductions, we got oriented to the organization. We did a bunch of planning and preparation with the internal group, figured out who's who in the zoo, figured all that kind of stuff up front. That was sort of the first phase, and that lasted, arguably 2 to 3 months, just getting all that stuff in there, creating some rollout plans that we'll dive into in a second here. Once we kind of done all our planning preparation, we then move into the installation strategy and training, where we're going to make sure we get the software installed, train the project team on the software. Once they understand the technology, then dive into some of the strategy and some of those major decisions on how you want to move forward with the project. We would then test all that out with a couple pilot groups, putting into practice our process and approach and technology, and then get some fine-tune some stuff to right-size the fit of the process for the organization based on their capacity and culture and all that good stuff, and then kind of rolling out to the rest of the organization. So sort of like a department by department, typically juggling 2 to 3 up maybe 5 departments at a time, moving forward, because the project team can always move fast in the business. And one thing that we really strive to do in the project was to not overtax the departments and really only try and work with them for 1 to 2 hours a week over the course of an 8-week period. So looking at the first phase, diving into that a little bit, the planning phase, we created a detailed project plan, figured out all those major activities, milestones, so that stuff, maybe not super interesting, but needs to be done. We would then do a strategic roadmap. This is sort of a key thing, and is sort of one of the biggest mistakes that organizations make is when you're going to work through the organization, you do it function by function or department by department, where that happens to be. And it's kind of critical to work. Basically, you want to work in the organization from those groups that you're going to be the most successful with through to the more difficult groups. And they could be more difficult because they have more content, because they're a larger group, because they work in different locations, because they've had a negative experience with SharePoint in the past. Maybe they have change fatigue because they just wrote on their system. Whatever that happens to be, you want to start with that happy-go-lucky, nice group of people that maybe are technically savvy, that don't have a lot of complexity in their group, to practice, the project approach and fine-tune all your training materials, etc. And then work through those more difficult groups, because you will invariably have some departments in the organization that maybe have had a negative experience in doing an ECM project in the past, and maybe you're reluctant to come on board. And the last thing you want to do is give them some cannon fodder to support the decision not to move forward. You want to have a couple case studies and building your successes over time. Some additional benefits of this is that the project team, the joint project team, goes through its storming, forming, norming phases of a project team. And so by the time they hit those more difficult groups in the organization towards the end of the project, they're a much more fine-tuned, well-honed machine. You're also going to come to those more complex groups perhaps with more pre-made solutions. So you're going to know how you're dealing with committees or projects or meeting minutes, etc. So a lot of benefit. And so when you work with those bigger, more complex, more difficult, more risky groups, you're minimizing the risk in dealing with them, because you have a more competent team and you have more pre-baked solutions. You can just really focus on their core corpus of content that they need to work with on a daily basis.
Michael,
Yeah.
we have a question actually, before you go too much farther, since you're talking about joint teams. Can you explain what a tiger team is?
Yeah, I believe it comes from a NASA, which was their code name for 2 people that were trying to solve problems. But essentially, typically it's going to be someone from the consultancy that you're working with, in this case Gravity Union, and then someone from the business. Typically the complementary skills might be that one person is more technically oriented, knows how to configure SharePoint. The other person may be more of a business analyst. But it doesn't really matter too much, because you're all going to go through this process together. And then each tiger team kind of pairs up and will tackle a handful of groups at a time. So even going on to the next slide, you can see here that we kind of kick off, and we'll actually have, if you kind of go to 1 month, you can see that at any given point in time, we have upwards of 6 to 7 groups at a time that we're working with. And so each tiger team may be assigned 2 to 3 groups that they're kind of juggling. But they really are the kind of the core project team that goes out to the business, does requirements, analysis, design, the training, the whole kind of soup to nuts part of the project. So hopefully that'll clear things up on that. Great question. So basically we work through this strategy, and then we figure out what is the best possible path through the organization based on some metrics. We may identify some blackout periods where maybe a certain group isn't available because it's their financial year end, whatever that happens to be, and create just a notional path through the organization, function by function, department by department, whatever kind of makes sense for your organization. But kind of critically working through the easy, happy, low complexity groups through the more difficult, larger, complex groups towards the end of the project. Then designing a solution architecture. This was an on-premise solution, so we had to figure out how many servers and how much RAM and all that kind of good stuff to design stuff. So that was all the kind of preparation and planning that went into the project. So with that out of the way, we then can go into the sort of strategy and training aspect of the project. So looking back at our overall kind of rollout process here, we're into the installation strategy and training. So we do the solution install, running some scripts, getting some stuff installed into the servers. We would then do the core project team training. So we would sort of a first stab at reviewing the technology, how we're going to configure SharePoint and in this case Collabware from a solution standpoint. Not that we're expecting them to have that mash at this point in time, but we're starting to build up that skill set. And then of course this is also going to inform any decisions around our strategy. So are we going to classify everything with Collabware or not? And it'll be easier to make those decisions once you've been exposed to technology and sort of how it works. We would then move into strategy development. And so this is where we want to kind of pre-bake decisions, those key major decisions that can be large political debates in organizations to kind of smooth out that decision process once you're engaging with the departments. And you want to make sure that you sort of have a common messaging from the entire project team when dealing with end users. So there's a bunch of benefits in working through the kind of core strategies upfront. And so those strategies that we sort of identified are your information architecture. So your navigation, your metadata, your approach to making sure we have a flat hierarchy so that we don't have to restructure SharePoint if you go through reorganization in the enterprise. Migration. So how far back are we migrating content? Are we going to the end of times, or are we just focusing on current content? Are we going back a year or two, which is usually the average? What tools are we using for migration? Who's going to be responsible for migration? Just figuring out all those major questions. Search, for example, like who's going to own search and curate it and kind of fine tune it to make sure it's the best possible search experience. From a security standpoint, are we leveraging Active Directory groups or simply adding individual users to SharePoint sites? Are we going to be open by default, or are we going to have more of a closed security posture? Then applied records management. So everyone on the phone probably has a file plan built out, but and most of those file plans are typically built out with paper in mind. So you're going to have that active stage, followed by the semi-active stage, followed by some kind of disposition process or archival process. And so with applied records management, what we want to do is really dive into, well, now that we actually have a lot more capabilities in the electronic domain, we have other considerations to make. So for example, how long of a collaboration window do we give end users to work on that content before we lock it down and protect it as a record? It could be notions around when do we archive content to a record center and remove it from the current solution. So if you have a policy or procedure that's now have been superseded or is now obsolete, we may want to move that away from the current SharePoint solution so that no one comes across that content by accident. And then if we do have archived content, should people be able to search it? So going through those major decisions in kind of a very pragmatic electronic focused solution. Governance, so working out our roles, responsibilities, processes, and policies and procedures to make sure that we maintain and maximize the ROI of the platform moving forward. And then critically, and probably most importantly, the change management. So to give you a bit of an example, diving a little bit deeper into the strategy, from a change management perspective, it's really diving into what we see as the key pillars. So not only communication and training, but also supports that post-go live process of making sure that we're actively following with people to understand what their problems are. Maybe Adobe's not working perfectly, or they're trying to upload a large AutoCAD file and that wasn't the best decision. So really focusing on those three dimensions of support. So as an example, we hashed out a whole training plan. And so for each kind of major role in the organization, whether it's IT support or your end users or your power users within a group, looking at how much training they needed and who needs to attend and when will be scheduled and what format does it come in and so on and so forth. Then we kind of got all of our training material pre-baked. So we had all the slides and decks and lessons and labs ready to go, and then pre-baked a bunch of communication for the organization. So super informative emails and notices to be sent out to organizations. So yeah, so really working through all those strategies with the core project team post-training to understand how we're going to approach the project and trying to pre-bake a lot of those decisions moving forward. So now at this point, we've done our planning, we've done our preparation, We've got the software installed. Our core project team has been trained up. We've worked through our process, our approaches, and our strategies. And now we're ready to test all that out with the first couple of pilot groups. So moving into the pilot group phase, we'll move through kind of this process that we've been fine-tuning, that I've been fine-tuning for about 10 years, that we worked with here. And so to give you a high overview, we jump off with a current state assessment, understanding who they are in the organization, what are their responsibilities, who do they work with, going into some solution requirements, going into a deep dive into their content. So if you're in finance, how many invoices do you get? How often do they come? What format are they? Are they coming in paper? Are they PDFs? How are they currently stored? Any special notes around security or file formats, etc. Who creates it? Who consumes it? And then at that point, you may even map that back to your file plan as well. Content, I think a lot of people see content management as a really, really complex scenario, and it really is. And I think what we try to do in the project, and this worked well, is that really we're kind of shining light on the problem space, just a little bit of light, but from 3 different angles, and that gives us just enough information to kind of go into a bit of a prototype process. So once we've done the content audit, we know the requirements, the current state assessment, we jump into a card sort, an interactive way to start to organize their information architecture. We would then start to document some of those from a high level in terms of the behind-the-scene configuration of SharePoint. And then at this point, we're ready to jump into a solution prototype, review that with people, get their feedback, make some iterative cycles there of fine-tuning their solution. Once the solution is further mature, we'll do the migration, configure Collabware, and do a retrospective or lessons learned. So to dive into this a little bit more focused, we would also do, specifically from that previous slide, is we do departmental training. And so it's kind of funny, a lot of you have probably been in technical training, which has a tendency to be off-site for 4 to 8 hours, and you're drinking from a fire hose, and you're expected to know how to use the software moving forward. And that just, in every other domain of learning, it would seem to me that we do a couple hours a week in some hands-on lecture lab type scenarios. So whether that's guitar or karate or Math 10, we know that trying to learn Math 10 in a day or two isn't going to be a successful venture. So I'm really trying to be bacon training, so that we're probably doing an hour of training per week with each department as they go through this process, which helps inform their requirements and so on and so forth as well. So again, we would dig into the current state assessment. What does the group do? Who do they work with? What are the key processes? What are the main pain points? We would go in from the current state assessment to business requirements. We would dive into the content audit, where we're capturing perhaps the volume of content. How many gigabytes are we talking about? How many thousands of documents or hundreds of documents are we talking about? How is it currently organized? What's the current folder structure or the current metadata? That may inform how we're going to create that solution in SharePoint to create the optimal, best possible user experience. We may be capturing file formats, any notes about security or compliance, record category, etc. So spending a couple hours to work with them and document their content. Once we have that, we've got a pretty good picture of this group and how they work and their content, and we're able to go into a bit of a cards or exercise.
Sorry, can I just interrupt for a moment? We have a question that we may want to address. So what are the use cases for moving records to the record center when you can simply hide them from the in-place repository's main view?
You can. So the one is going to be, I can find that through search. So just because it's hidden from a view doesn't mean it's not being crawled by the SharePoint search engine. And so if I've filtered out a policy or procedure that's now obsolete, it's quite possible that it still shows up in my search. And when I do a search for our drug and alcohol policy, I find the drug and alcohol policy from 1978, which maybe is now in line with the 2020, since we have cannabis is legal. But yeah, you're not guaranteed. Like, that's sort of what we would call security through obscurity. So that's one thing. Also, in an on-premise environment, we always have to have our kind of big picture, long-term hat on. And so you can imagine that over time, we're going to end up with gigabytes and terabytes and petabytes of content in this system. When we archive content to a record center in SharePoint, we're actually moving it to a different database behind the scenes. And so in a disaster recovery from an on-premises scenario, from a disaster recovery, if our SharePoint server goes up in flames, gets dropped by a cleaner who's vacuuming underneath it, and then we have to build that environment from scratch and bring that database over. We're getting down to physics. If I have to copy a database over that's only 10 gigabytes in size and restore that and create my SharePoint environment, from an operational standpoint, I can get that up and running sooner. And those archival record centers, I can restore at a later point in time. So potentially there's a whole bunch of rationale why you might want to do that. But typically for scalability, SharePoint does tend to slow down once you get more than 5 to 10,000 documents in a given library. So that could be a rationale. I want to scale out, make sure that my solution is optimal as possible, so on and so forth. So a bunch of rationale, and that's exactly, like, great question that always comes up, and we want to work through that and create a decision, sort of a matrix decision. When do we want to archive that content to a record center?
That's great. I just want to let everybody know we're getting a few questions in, so thank you so much. Keep them coming. We'll get to as many as we can in the session. Just one more related one that I think I'll ask you right now, Michael, since we're on this topic, and we're sort of in this area. By saying prototype, do you mean pilot project or something else? So sort of what do we mean by prototype?
The pilot groups, I guess. So the pilot groups, it's not throwaway stuff. It's really, we're just testing out, we're piloting the process, and we're actually building up the live site for those groups. So it's not throwaway, and that I know that pilot can potentially be used in that form. So if the question was in regards to the pilot projects, the real sites that we're building, we're just really piloting the process moving forward. And then potentially there's different rationale. I forget how we used the term before, but when we, the reality is you don't know for sure what you want to see in your solution until you get your hands on it and you've used it. So for example, there may have been a requirement to copy or to extract a GST amount out of a given invoice and copy and paste that into the library that you're working within. And then after uploading 100 invoices, you've realized that it's pretty painful to do that, and you want to make that small change for the solution. Remove those points of friction, do a little bit of sanding in the solution, if you will. So we want to get the prototype created, get that in front of end users. We're probably at that 80-20 point where you have it mostly correct. Give them a chance to use it and use it for real, and then give us that feedback. And this would come into the communication strategy, but we do make a commitment that if the end users aren't happy with the solution, that we would fix it. And because we're in a very agile process where we're building a prototype, we're getting feedback, we're making changes, the odds of us getting something wrong and having to redo things from scratch is so low. It's never happened in the 250 departments that I've onboarded in my career. But end users love to hear that because they're quite used to having a system imposed on them, right? Some consultants come in, they do the requirements analysis design, they go off and they build something and maybe it doesn't work quite right and you're kind of unhappy with it. And the consultants are like, sorry, we really baked into our process the ability to be very agile, adjust course, and make sure that people are happy with the final solution. I think I went off on a bit of a tangent there. All right. Any other relevant questions that have come up, Jas?
We have a few more questions. We'll see. We're going to cover a few of them actually that I'm seeing later. So sit tight, and then I'll jump in again at another moment.
Okay, excellent. So we're doing the card sorting. Obviously, in the world of COVID, we have tools to do this online. But the idea is that we want to focus on our nomenclature and our terminology and get that down, and starting to form the solution, but in a very abstract way that people don't get too focused on colors and stuff like that. After that, we may start to document this into a mind map, or we can start to document metadata. And this is, you're going to see some of this stuff come up in the navigation for corporate communications, but it's a bit more of a permanent way of documenting things because the cards tend to get lost, etc. And at this point, especially coming to the table with previous experience as a consultancy, we know their requirements, we know what their content looks like, we know what their hopes and dreams are, what their current pain points are, and we can go in and do a prototype for them. So we'll go and build a prototype in SharePoint. We'll walk them through the prototype, we'll let them upload some dummy data, we'll get some feedback, let them sleep on it. This may take 1 or 2 sessions. We're not too concerned about getting it right the first time. So we'll do this iterative process. We're making some changes to it, getting some feedback, making sure they're happy with it. Again, tying this back into autonomy. They really have control over what we're building to a degree. Obviously, we're going to have some guiding lanes to make sure we're following best practices from an enterprise and scalability standpoint, but to make sure that they have control and make sure they're happy with it, as well as mastery, right? The fact that we're going to bring, this is another key point maybe I missed before, really bringing that whole group for this journey. So having the entire department or sub-department or function be part of this journey. So they're all part of the content audit, they're all part of the card sorting, they're all part of the prototype review, and that's in a way is also training them on the solution. So by the time we go live 8 weeks later, they've seen the solution and the terminology, the nomenclature, and we've had these in-depth discussions with the solution that they know where everything is, and it's just not that much of an issue. Versus if you do a bunch of requirements analysis, you go away, you build something, then also surprise them 2 months later with a solution, they're probably going to be a little bit lost. So yeah, iterative prototyping. We may at this point now wash over, now that the we've done a couple iterations of the prototype, they're really happy with it. We still make the commitment, or you would want to make the commitment, that if you're still not happy a couple weeks after go live, we'll make some changes. It seldom happens, but that commitment goes a long way in building trust in the relationship with the business. But at this point, because there may not be a one-to-one bucket of the original content audit to the new solution, and so we'll kind of want to wash over that content now, perhaps with a privacy lens, perhaps with a compliance lens, and perhaps with a security lens. So making sure that we're not going to be exposing sensitive content, employee file, health records, etc. And so we can map this content that's currently in the system back to the file plan from a conceptual standpoint. So now we understand what the content is from a compliance and security and privacy standpoint. We then move into migration.
Sorry, before you go into this, can I ask a question, Michael? Just
yeah,
related to the records classification, is there an advantage to migrating the documents before configuring with CLM?
No, so because there could be some volatility post go live. Once things become a record, they're a bit more sticky. You can't change metadata. You can't. You can, but you have to undeclare them, and to do that after the fact can be a little bit more intensive from an effort standpoint. So typically, we build the solution out. We map the content into the file plan conceptually. We then do the migration into the system, and then once the content for that specific group is migrated, we then layer on our Collabware configuration. Now we may have built out the Collabware configuration in a test environment and tested it out, make sure we're happy with it and that it works, and we can migrate those workflows over. But we typically want to go through the migration process because the migration process, as you see here, we typically have 3 dimensions to that. We do have tools. So there's ShareGate's a popular tool. That's a screenshot of ShareGate. You may want to script the content. Sometimes it's just more performant, or it makes more sense to script content. So if you've got 25,000 employee files, to have a script that walks through each employee file, massages those employee files into your new solution, and then moves the content over. But critically, what we know that we are quite different in the market is we do migration parties for the groups. And so this is a little bit counterintuitive, but the idea is we actually throw a party. Now, some cultures don't like the word party, but that's okay. We'll bring food and snacks to these parties, and we'll sit down beside the end users, and maybe we migrate over their current project, or we're going to migrate over 10 employee files. And now we're using the system for real, but it's a chance to reinforce our training. It's a chance to identify points of friction that maybe we missed before. It's a chance to let their voices be heard one last time before they really start using day to day. And so what we've found is that the adoption of the solution post go live, if they've gone through some percentage of manual migration, is always much, much higher than those groups where the IT people go off and do all the migration for them. And the reality is that when IT does the migration, you're not necessarily not drawing any time for the business, because you may have questions about exception cases and stuff like that. And so, but in that case, all the interaction is more abstract, versus if you do some manual migration, it can actually be quicker. In some cases where we've only got 100 policies, well, it might take you a couple hours to configure a tool or try to script to do that migration. The reality is you can drag and drop 200 documents into SharePoint, let it upload for 10 minutes, open it up and quick edit and set all the metadata, and it actually would be faster. But we get the added benefit that we're reinforcing training, their comfort with the solution, our information architecture, the solution design, so on and so forth. And so, yeah, so once the migration is done and the dust is settled and they're pretty happy with it, We know how we want to classify it against the file plan. So we'll go ahead and we'll go into Collabware and do all that Collabware configuration, the file plan, the workflows and stuff like that, map that back to the content and let Collabware classify it. And then going forward, any content that's being added to the system gets automatically classified through the content rules in Collabware. So this is sort of show you that an actual prototype from our solution. Nothing too fancy. This is an employee portal with news and events and landing page. Is really talking about that large scale document management, records management solution. We had corporate policy that we built out for them, diving into a library, just trying to keep things nice and light and simple. We didn't want to over design it. We don't want to have to set 25 things of metadata when I upload a document. In this case, we have our policies in progress and their different statuses, draft and final and all that good stuff. And then of course, we've got version control, we've got document previews in SharePoint, really test it out. And then on any given document, I can click on it, go into the Collabware piece, and I can see the workflow that Collabware is running on that content. At some point, we're going to lock it down based on interaction with the system or based on time or whatever makes sense. And so we can go and validate that our content is running under the correct workflow, been classified against the right record category. I can look at the audit trail in Collabware as well and interact with Collabware that way as well. Again, most end users are probably not going into the Collabware piece, but the keeners might be. So that's sort of the departmental process that we would follow through each department. Because the project team can always move faster than the departments themselves. Typically, it's why each Tiger team is going to juggle 2 or 3 departments at a time. And then you might have one group that gets really busy. And so like in this case, they had HR had a big, huge hiring frenzy. They had to hire 200 people and we just paused them for a month and we focused on the other groups that we were working with. So from a larger picture, looking at the organizational rollout, so, we did our preparation and planning, we did the installation strategy and training for the core project group. We've tested out our process, our approach to governance and support and everything with our pilot groups. And now we're going to just move on to the rest of the organization. We know that the big bang is a seldom successful process. So really we're going to be just juggling 2, 3, 4, 5 departments at a time, according to our map. Some cool stuff, as cool as technology is, and all this may not be possible with COVID. We had a lot of success just having some PM tools in the space. This is our actual PM landing board. They're both kind of Scrum stuff, but the Kanban board, essentially each row is a department. Each department has their list of tasks and activities and deliverables on some paper items. And as those things were getting built or being reviewed, etc., those pieces of paper would kind of move across their journey to being signed off by the organization. And so this is all the departmental work. And then the non-departmental stuff, right? If we had to rebuild the test or staging environment, those activities would be in our Scrum area. And this allowed us to meet every morning for 10 to 15 minutes with the coffee with the team, talk through our risks and issues and blocks, give your status update in the stand-up, and then move things forward. One of my favorite things from this project, and I'll give credit to Mark, who was our client-side change manager that they brought on as an external consultant. But he had this really cool idea that since we were moving offices, that we would have a bit of a theme around moving for the project. And in this case, in our project room, each department got their own little moving truck that we posted up on the wall. And at first I was like, it's kind of a waste of time. But what was really cool and what I didn't anticipate is that the departments actually became competitive. So if they saw themselves slipping behind in other departments, they would actually make more time to work with us as a project team. They would actually try and make a bit of a competitive thing. So it's this really cool gamification, if you will, of the process in a paper-based format. And it's something I'm going to try, and it's a little bit tough to do right now with COVID, but I'm going to try and implement this in all of our projects moving forward. It's a really cool trick to kind of get people involved, and a great communication tool to show you where are you in this process and how much further do we have to go. And because people often forget some of the emails that you send them once in a while.
Michael, just a question about working together, since we're talking about sort of collaboration here. We have just a few questions, which I'm going to try to summarize into one point here. But can you speak to the question of whether implementation of this type of system should be done by IT or the records management department, or both? And who should ideally be maintaining the system? And sort of related to that, how much IT technical knowledge is required within an organization to maintain Collabware and SharePoint?
Yeah, great. A couple questions. Let's unpack those. So it really depends on how your organization is structured. Some organizations that we work with also have a dedicated enterprise content management group, right? That could be it. I think classically, and I apologize to any IT people on the call, classically SharePoint is sometimes owned by IT, but really SharePoint's a platform. And the solutions that you build on top of SharePoint as a platform should be owned by the business, right? So the employee portal, that intranet with the news and events, that should be open, that should be owned by corporate communications or HR, whoever happens to own that function within the organization. There's obviously a partnership that you have to have with IT to support that. But I would say arguably, from a governance model, roles, responsibilities, IT is going to have some roles, responsibilities to apply patches and updates, to run scripts, to do restorations of databases if something goes sideways. But in terms of the decision making for who's going to decide what our navigation looks like, that arguably should be owned by someone who's passionate about enterprise content management. Now, if your IT group happens to have a business analysis group within IT, and they have that skill set, by all means, that can certainly work. If records management wants to be the people that own that can certainly work as well. So every company is different, and it kind of depends on frankly the politics and the size and the culture and capacity of those various groups. And that would be something that when we talk about in their strategies and those initial strategies, Jas, governance was one of those topics, and that's a critical thing to work through. Who actually owns this, right? Who's going to make the final decision on some of the stuff? And you want to work through those roles, responsibilities to clarify that, because there may be some assumptions on both sides, and it's just great to get it out on the table, figure this stuff out early, so we don't have any infighting as we're rolling out to the various groups. Did I answer all the points there?
Yeah, I think so. And just in terms of support, is ongoing consulting usually required from specialists to keep the system running well?
No, our goal is to enable the organization. So many of our clients do rely on us for additional strategic consulting if they're going to go through a major upgrade. And it kind of depends. Like, did your people on the project team move on to other jobs, etc. So the various solutions there. But typically, most of our clients do own this moving forward, and that really is, enterprise content management is such an intimate type of solution, and you really do have to have some expertise and ownership within your organization to be successful over the long run, and then augment as needed. That being said, we're such a fun group to work with, Jas, that people want to.
Sorry, one more related thing. At some point, could we speak about doing this remotely? I know we have some experience doing migration parties remotely, and I don't know if you want to add on to that. We do typically use Teams, and we use technology where we can to work remotely with our clients now. But anything else you want to add, Michael?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly right. So I mean, a lot can be done remotely. I would say that perhaps it's not intuitive, but the biggest thing that I feel has been beneficial for us to work remotely, and that we found over time, even pre-COVID, is to actually work in a social dimension to the project. So what I find is typically missing when working remotely is just that small talk that you have before, after lunch or before your meeting, where you get to know people, because ultimately these are big, long projects. They can be stressful at times. And you really want to form a relationship both within the project team and with the business, and that's critical to be successful, I think, to be able to survive these things. So working in some social aspects, and then even this lessons learned little tiny logo that we have here, our icon on the screen, that was actually a digital tool that we had, so we were able to collaborate effectively in person. I mean, you're never going to replace that in-person experience, but we can certainly get pretty close with Teams and having video, making sure that everyone has their video turned on so you can see people's expressions and stuff like that. So another tool that we had in the rollout, this comes from our Collabware reporting pack. And this is giving us the high-level insight into how successful are we being. In this case, the bottom area, or the blue area, is all of the content that we've added to the system that has been classified against the file plan, and that has also been declared as a record. The gray area represents the content that we've added to the system. We know what it is from a compliance standpoint, i.e. it's been classified against our file plan, but hasn't been declared a record yet, because maybe it's a policy that hasn't been approved. It could be a project document that we're collaborating on, and we don't want to step on the toes of end users and declare things too early. And then the orange area is all the content of the system that hasn't been classified yet, and we only expect to see that if we're onboarding a new department and we've just done a bunch of migration, and we're looking to classify that at some point in the future. But it gives you that high-level view of, well, what's kind of our percentage of classification versus not classified, and you can dig into this content and dig into the report and go see. I see it's everything from the HR site. If you want to go look at a specific site, looking at an audit trail, and then looking at the number of documents being added and deleted or edited or viewed over time, and sort of seeing, like, are they actually using the system that we built for them, and just kind of keeping on top of that, making sure that people are happy with it. So the end result, so, you know, just for your own information, I would say on average is around 10 weeks from start to finish for each department. That's not effort, that's just how long we take to kind of balance putting too much pressure in the business versus and stressing them out, and still being successful. If you take 2 years to onboard a department, so many things will change. You won't be successful. But yeah, on average 10 weeks, so with the smallest being 6 weeks, the longest being 16 weeks, and then an effort from the project. On average, around 200 hours to do the requirements, analysis, training, migration, integration, all the good stuff, with the most complex department being around 400 hours. And then on average, around 40 hours from each department. Sort of the median or average on a weekly basis is about 2 hours. And then when we get to the migration, maybe it's a couple of 4-hour migration sessions. And typically the feedback we get back from users is, for the migration stuff, they just want to sit down for half a day and get it done in the migration parties. Also, another way to think of the project. So arguably like 95% of the effort goes into the business solution, right? That SharePoint solution that people use every day. And then so typically the RM piece is actually a pretty small fraction of that. So we'll spend, you know, weeks and weeks and weeks, a couple of months working with the department, figuring out their navigation, getting the content migrated in there, and then we'll spend one day, we'll lock ourselves from the records manager, and we'll map all that content to the file plan. Or from a technology perspective, most of the effort goes into SharePoint. The better, richer, cooler solution you do in SharePoint, the easier the Collabware piece actually is. So it's a cool synergy there. Cheesily, mission accomplished. Everyone onboarded. We ended up only doing one integration. 4 million documents migrated. 100% adoption across all the departments you onboarded. 18 months end to end. It was kind of cool to see just thousands of documents being added on a daily basis and then being classified against the file plan. For the SharePoint people, there's always a thing. They end up with around 450 content types. So a lot of detail, right? But with detail, really we get value. So we had content types for employee files and invoices and contracts and policies and procedures, around 300 site collections, 25,000 document libraries, and we did basically kind of hit our 1,000% of documents being classified against the file plan, and then declared as records. Some feedback. So certainly some people that were working from a network file storage, where they hopped into their messy labyrinth of network folders, and you ran into contract v1, contract v2, final underscore final, Dugan's copy, Mike's copy, Bob's copy, to the single source of truth, search-driven collaborative platform. People really did find an increase in value and ROI, and making their groups more efficient. This is one of my highlights. Is Diana, one of our business analysts, and her partner at the LDB got this thank you card from the group because they were just so happy with the process and they had such a fun time, and it really did kind of improve their day-to-day work experience. And then from an all-up kind of feedback from the organization, not perfect, but across the board, certainly sort of in between 4 to 5, it was easy to learn. It was increase their confidence in finding content, that the version that they got was the right version. It was easy to share. Perhaps SharePoint isn't quite as quick as emailing and network file storage, but we get the other benefits from it. So certainly some time savings, and then people were recommending it overall. So wrap this up in hopefully 2 minutes. We'll have 5 minutes for questions. So lessons learned, that top-down support's critical. Everyone knows this, but we need to have executive buy-in. Training is critically important. I was talking to an organization and their CIO said, no one gets more than an hour training on SharePoint. And we also know that, the research tells us that people tend to forget 70% of their training or of any kind of training within like a couple days, and they forget 90% of what they learned within a week. And so if you're getting 60 minutes of training on SharePoint and you forget 90% of it within a week, you've got what, 6 minutes or so of SharePoint training you can take with you. So really, you know, that an hour or two per week lecture lab, review what you learned the week before, lots of training. You can't have as much training. You probably want to go for, you want to have like 5 to 10% of the people complain about that there was too much training, and you know, hit the sweet spot. The more bespoke the solution, the more ROI there is for the end user, and the easier just to classify against the file plan. So there are a lot of people that kind of assume you build out a SharePoint site and everything's a template and you can just give that template to everyone. But the reality is everyone's work is different. HR has employee files, IT has IT projects, and that detail of my employee files and to know what department they're in, their hire date, that's the value that they get from it. So you really do need to take the time to do things properly. Active support is critical. This is always the most positive thing when we ask, what was the favorite thing that you about the project, and it was this active support where we swing by their desk and we ask them what's working, what's not working, and then fixing things fairly expeditiously, like really quickly. And then finally, to have fun, right? This is a long project, and we had potlucks and we had these migration parties, and we really trying to have fun on the project, and that really helped create a relationship to the project team and the business, and helped smooth out some of those issues. I'll quickly go through the kind of bonus stuff here. The top 5 mistakes, that we see companies make. The first is an arbitrary end date, right? You get someone up the ladder, up the chain of command, who says, well, you know, we have a certain budget. Our budget expires in March, therefore we have 6 months to get this done, and that's just not going to work. You're not going to be successful. The dump it in SharePoint and we'll fix it later mentality. So sometimes if you have a tight timeline, people say, let's just get everything in SharePoint and we'll organize it later. The reality is it's always more expensive to do that. It's always way more difficult to do that. And then you kind of have this additional sort of hidden cost of that you're probably creating a negative experience for end users. And to get them on their journey at some point in the future will be a bit more difficult. Not building a bespoke solution. So this notion that a lot of people tend to assume you can just kind of template everything, but it's those high value solutions around contracts, employee files, etc., that really drives the value for the business. So really taking the time to build those cool solutions, and then no strategic ordering of departments, as well as avoiding end user engagement. I just want to leave a couple minutes there for questions. So we're at exactly 4 minutes left. Jas, any new questions popping up? Okay, well, thank you so much for attending today. It was certainly fun for us. And good luck on your enterprise content management and records management initiative. Have a great day. Thanks. Bye-bye.